So, Jack, I want to compliment you. You've been on the cutting edge of what's happening in Uvalde. I think this is important for two reasons. Number one, we should always care about the truth, always. But number two, I think that it's important when it comes to our gun control debate right now. Because if we look at Uvalde, as the facts actually show us, this has very little to do about gun purchasing or red flag laws, and a lot more about a police failure to intervene. What are your thoughts?
Well, one of the big things that people need to understand about Uvalde, and it's actually something that even in the initial reporting, and this is something where I do have to ask for forgiveness on, because when this all happened, I was over in Davos, Switzerland. I'm going up and down the Alps. We're, getting detained. We went to Ukraine. I come back. And that's when I really was able to start sinking my teeth into the details here. Then yesterday, the Texas Department of Public Safety comes out. That's the head of the Texas Police. And they start releasing these documents based on the timeline, based on some of the 911 calls, the dispatcher calls with the local chief. And so now we've been able to dig through those documents, to dig through this hearing. And one thing that I think everybody needs to understand is that this guy, Pete Arredondo. One of the names you need to memorize in this is Pete Arredondo. Originally, the way it was being reported, I think a lot of people had the misunderstanding that he was the chief of police for all of Uvalde. It's not true. He's actually the chief of police for the Uvalde CIDS, the Consolidated Independent, or CISD school district. So he's the chief of police just for that school. That is his sole duty, his sole responsibility, and it's a 6-man force that is directly assigned for the security of that school. They're brought on by the school board, and then that's, of course, working in conjunction with the city council. But this really is a situation where he had one charge, and that was the defense of this school. And so when you're looking into this and you're hearing, and we can go through a little bit of the timeline if you want to.
Yeah, please do.
When you're hearing this, it doesn't appear that they actually had a very strong plan for how to deal with an active shooter. They've gone through some trainings and they've read a few, materials, the PowerPoints that get pushed out by DOJ, et cetera, that most law enforcement agencies around the country go through. But sure, they check the box, but did they have an actual plan for dealing with school shooters within the geography of their school itself? Because this school district, it does include multiple schools. You've got elementary school, middle school, you've got a high school nearby, you've got multiple buildings, multiple facilities. You need to, if you're assigned to a school like that, you need to be understanding of that day in, day out. So the two biggest things that I think right off the bat that we can immediately identify as lies, essentially, that were told in the early days of this. And these were lies that unfortunately led Greg Abbott, I think the day after this happened, to praise the response of the police. Obviously, that has not aged very well. But then he later came out, I think it's almost immediately, and said that he had been misled. The first thing they told us, Charlie, was, remember, they claimed that they engaged the shooter outside the school in the parking lot. Remember, the very first headlines that we were hearing on this said, there was an engagement. Then they shot the officers. The officers fell back. The shooter was able to go inside. That never happened. That never happened whatsoever. That was a smokescreen. I don't know exactly who started that story. Never true. Didn't happen. The person who was engaged, by the way, was a teacher that one of the responding officers mistook for the shooter. The shooter at the time was, in fact, outside the school at that point. But because the responding officer misidentified the shooter, or misidentified the teacher as the shooter was hiding behind a car, used that moment to slip inside when they saw the door was open. That's number one. Number two, in terms of a lie that we're seeing on this, we were told again and again, all these stories about you need a special key to be able to open the classroom 111 and 112, and they needed the special key, and they had to wait for the special key, and they had to go dig up this janitor, and Bortak comes in, and they're trying different keys, and they finally find the master key. And we were told that the reason that they needed that was because the doors were locked from the inside. What was revealed yesterday at the hearing from Texas DPS, number one, they actually brought the doors into the Texas legislature there in Austin, and it demonstrated for the legislators, those doors do not lock from the inside. You can't lock them from the inside. The only way they could be locked from the inside is if there was an electronic system that it's sort of an auto lockdown procedure. They weren't locked. We know they weren't locked because the shooter was going in and out. And that's the second part of the lie. From the footage that reporters, it hasn't been released completely yet. Now we do need to see this, and I think we're really at the point where we need to demand the body cam of Chief Arredondo in this.
That's
because
hard to watch.
he's claiming, well, from what we see, Charlie, is that he never actually went into the classroom, right? That he stayed in the hallway. So I want to know what happened in that hallway, right? He's claiming that they went up, they tried the doors, they couldn't enter. We haven't found any surveillance footage whatsoever of officers simply trying to open the door, jiggle the handle to see if the room was actually locked or not. Because if this shooter's going in and out, then guess what? That means that that door is not locked. So we've been able to blow two major holes in the story that have been told thus far. And then when you're looking through some of the timeline of this, when you're looking at through some of the statements that were being made at the time they were being made, you can see what this should have been an amazing response, right? Because within the first 3 minutes of that shooter entering that classroom, you had officers in the hallway. Within 3 minutes, which would have been amazing, right? Which would have been this wonderful story about police officers stopping a school shooter within 3 minutes, and it would have been a great, resounding success story for having police officers assigned to schools. That doesn't happen. At that point, Arredondo is on the dispatcher at 11:40 saying that we only have pistols, we don't have rifles.
But that's not true, right? I want to pause you here,
Jack. You can
Jack.
see in the photos.
Yeah, and we have the photos up on screen. So they look like they have long rifles, long guns with shields. How is this possible? This guy's just making this stuff up. He's a liar.
Right, so this Pete Arredondo, and I see some people saying, well, it's because he didn't have his radio on him. Now, he leaves his radio outside the school, isn't able to communicate from his point in the hallway to the officers that are in other points of the hallway, yet he's the chief of police of school security. And when you look at this guy, and some people have made light of the fact that he is someone who donated to Biden, he is someone who donated to Beto, not a lot of money, a couple bucks here and there, but the fact of the matter is that, is he somebody who isn't exactly a conservative, isn't exactly a traditional what we would think of as a police officer, that, it seems that he has a pretty good record up until this. But when you listen to some of the statements and you go back to the original things that he said, then we match it up with the photos that are coming out from the hallway, when we match it up with the dispatcher police call that he was made. He had a phone call. He had to use a cell phone because he didn't have his radio.
But let me make sure I understand this, Jack. There was a 1 hour gap between when the police officers were in the hallway between when they neutralized the shooter. Is that still correct?
100%.
Okay. So why didn't the police officers then go with their shields, 19 of them, and their long guns into the classroom and go neutralize the shooter? Why didn't they do that?
I think I've been able to pinpoint this. And again, so Arredondo, who was essentially the incident commander on the scene. Of course, his lawyers are saying that he never claimed to be the incident commander because he's got a law firm now. Uvalde City has hired a private law firm because they're trying to block the body cam footage coming out in terms of this, right? We know they really don't want that coming out. What it seems happened was he misunderstood the situation. He thought that it was a barricaded shooter with hostages in the situation.
Hold on a second. This is an hour, Jack.
And then is responding based on that.
But for 1 hour, you just stand in the hall with long guns while you hear people screaming and suffering? I mean, what playbook are they following? There's no other excuse for this than being a coward. Period. End of story.
Charlie, it's completely insane when you look at some of the explanations that he's trying to come up with, the way his lawyers are trying to block the footage from coming out, the way the city has hired this private law firm to block footage from coming out, because you hear the parents. The parents, by the way, and we have the other story that just came out, Post Millennial has it, where an officer who arrived at the scene, off-duty officer, who was a husband of one of the teachers in the room, I don't know if it's 111 or 112, but one of the rooms arrives with his gun, says, I need to go in because my wife just called me. She said she's been shot.
And then they detained
officers
him.
outside detain him, disarm him.
So the
and
police were
refrain
more
from
worried
going.
about disarming and detaining parents and spouses. But again, I'm failing to understand this. You have 19 people that just stand and do nothing for an hour. Is that a fair thing to say, Jack, or am I oversimplifying it?
It's they're throwing up that they were looking for a key, that they didn't know if they could get in. Arredondo at one point, Charlie, and this is damning for him. This is absolutely damning for him. At one point he calls the dispatcher and says, "We only have pistols. We are outgunned. We need SWAT
But it's just
here."
we now have pictures that show,
And we know that that's false.
And so I'm just trying to comprehend here where there might be some way I could be wrong, because we went really hard, really quick, as you know, Jack. And if it turns out the facts are only further strengthening our original gut instinct here, right? I have to wonder what is the 19 people that did that? How could they live with themselves by standing there for an hour while kids are getting massacred? Like, this is not the police I grew up with. These are not the police I know. Who are these people?
Who's got a teacher in there who was killed, by the way, killed throwing herself in front of the children,
yes,
sacrificing herself to try to save people by jumping in front of them, taking the bullets.
But the police were too worried to arrest him, but did nothing about the actual shooter. Is that right?
We're also hearing, by the way, that one of the officers that was in that hallway had a daughter who was killed in that room. And so
why didn't he go in? I don't understand. This is not the country I grew up in, Jack. The country I grew up in is that the two towers have been hit. I don't care what people are. I'm going to go save their lives.
Right.
I don't get what country do we live in now, Jack?
Charlie, we live in a country where we got rid of toxic masculinity. We turned into a country of proceduralists and bureaucrats and middle managers. And we think that, well, we have to follow the protocol and we have to follow the guidance. And we're waiting for someone to come down from on high to tell us what we're supposed to do. And we've become a country that is afraid to act. And at this point, we had 19 men, fully armed.
With shields.
Body armor, ballistic shields. And I hear people saying, well, maybe they weren't the right kind of ballistic shields. And this body armor maybe isn't rated for AR-15. Since Columbine, every police officer is taught, if you have an active shooter situation, you go.
We got to go to a break.
Go in, you're there to serve and protect.